All right, everyone, welcome back to a special Sunday session of the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. Today, we are pleased and honored to welcome to our class this afternoon Dr. Erik Gellman of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who will talk a good bit this evening about the Southern Negro Youth Congress and its importance to the radical history of the nation during and after the Great Depression. Dr. Gellman, again, has been a guest of the Modjeska School before. We've always had a great time when he's visited us, and I'm looking forward to another fantastic event this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Green. I wanted to set up the discussion with Dr. Gellman with me finding out about the Southern Negro Youth Congress. As anybody that's been listening to me for a while knows that I spent the last 18 years of Modjeska's life being her right-hand person and her left-hand person. But I didn't know about the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And there was a quote that was in Becky's first book about Modjeska that said, if the Southern Negro Youth Congress had not been smashed and the young Black and white people kept working together, things would be different today. And so I was trying to find out about the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And at pretty much the same time, it was 2014, the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, had decided we were post-racial because we had a Black president. And they struck down Section 5, the pre-clearance requirement of the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act. And so people like myself that have been doing voting rights in the South for many years, well, everybody, including the lawmakers, since 1965 had to rely on what's called a Section 5 letter for pre-clearance from the Justice Department before you could change a voting rights law. And so I was at Tulane speaking to a bunch of old voting rights people in the South, and tired people and not real happy about what was happening. And I quoted my mentor, and I said, they asked her, how do you keep doing this decade after decade? And she thought, and she said, well, I guess I'm just selfish because it makes me feel good. And that was kind of that really important understanding that I have, that I am the first front of my revolution and I'm the one I need to be working on. And so somebody came up to me afterwards and said, I know who your mentor was. I said, who? He said, Modjeska Simkins. I said, how do you know that? He said, I did my PhD thesis on the Southern Negro Youth Congress she organized in Columbia, South Carolina in 1946. Would you like the FBI file on it? I said, oh, yes. And so that was my entree into the Southern Negro Youth Congress, with the records the FBI kept, and then I knew how many there were. I think 170 white delegates and a goodly smattering of union people. The CIO, the FL, didn't have people of color in it at that point, 1946. And so the Congress of Industrial Organizations was there in a large way. And they were the people that were running the show that day. Dr. Gellman will get more into that. They were young communists. And so Modjeska, one of the other things that's in the early book is her talking about being red smeared. She said, up and down the East Coast. We cannot make insignificant the impact of the way that communism in those days, it's migrants in another day, it's gay people another day, the way the power structure will retain their control and the attention of the population by whipping up hysteria about something that's tangential to the real problem that working people share. And so when working people figure that out, we're going to have some changes around here. It didn't happen in Modjeska's lifetime. It's going to have to really hurry up to happen in my lifetime. But that's what the Modjeska School is about, why we're trying to institutionalize it. So that was 2014. I started learning about the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And in 2016 was the 70th anniversary of the meeting in Columbia. And I spent the ensuing year trying to figure out why the hell was this global event with all the eyes on South Carolina? Why was it in South Carolina? And so I'm going to let Dr. Gellman pick it up there, because those of you that read your homework or read Becky's book about History Denied, you know the details. What I think is really important is understanding how what happened then happens again and again and again. And so we need to be prepared for it. So I'm going to bring on Dr. Gellman, who's been a great fixture in my recent awareness. Eric, take it.
Great. Well, thanks, Brett, and thanks, Robert, and thanks for all of you for joining us on such a what I assume is a gorgeous afternoon there in Columbia or wherever you're coming from. It is in Chapel Hill. I want to talk a little bit about the Southern Negro Youth Congress, specifically the Columbia Conference that you read about in 1946 that was just so significant. Before I do that, Brett, just as you were talking with your in the intro, I looked on my desk and I found there's a cassette tape sitting here that I think you and the folks at the school would really appreciate. I was just writing something in tribute to Esther Cooper Jackson. Esther Cooper Jackson is a fundamental leader in the Southern Negro Youth Congress of the younger generation to Modjeska, but certainly they worked together in various ways, especially during and just after World War II. And I think this is from the Tamiment Library in New York, 1989 Conference on Civil Rights Studies, Session 1, The Early Years, featuring Virginia Durr, Modjeska Simkins, Ann Braden, etc., Sarah Evans, and others. I think they're talking about the Southern Negro Youth Congress too. So I don't know if you remember these cassette tapes, but I should get you a copy of this. So what I want to talk about, and I'll just share my screen here in a second, is the incredible optimism that occurred right after World War II. And in particular, in the world's firing line, which you would think one of the most unlikely places for the world's firing line would be Columbia, South Carolina, and South Carolina more generally. But I hope to explain to you all why that was the case. So let me share my screen here. Let's see, or maybe the host. Do you need to make me a co-host or something? Oh, here we go. Yep. All right. PowerPoint. All right. Can you all see my slides now?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So, I wrote this book that took me a decade to write, and it's called Death Blow to Jim Crow. It's about the National Negro Congress. The National Negro Congress was the parent organization to the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And I won't go into all the details of the book, except I need to give you a little bit of background knowledge in order to understand what was happening right after World War II. One thing I'll say about the book is that it came out in 2012, and I think all of you can appreciate that it was a weird reaction when it came out. I mean, it was celebrated and well reviewed and all that stuff, but a lot of people said, "Oh, anti-fascism, isn't that kind of a historical anachronism? Does that really exist anymore?" Right? In that 2012 sort of Obama post-racial moment, And unfortunately, here we are 10 years later, and this book couldn't be more relevant, right? 10 years later. I don't think any American today would say, what's fascism? Or like, does fascism still exist in any form in America today? Which is a sad fact, but it also makes the book more relevant, I think, to talking about not just the 30s and 40s, but the current struggle. Okay, so National Negro Congress, just really briefly, it was this idea to bring together all of the existing Black-led organizations in America into a single umbrella organization. So you had some Garveyites still around in the 30s. You had the NAACP and the Urban League and other institutions that were for racial advancement. But they weren't really talking to each other. And the other thing they weren't doing is really advancing the cause in a militant way. The NAACP was at this point was still very much, we don't want to defend the young men accused of rape in Scottsboro, Alabama. We are polite negotiators and we're for gradualism, right? And the Urban League was more of a job placement group. So along comes this sort of Black left. And they want to not only harness all of the energy of existing organizations, but they also want to push all those organizations to the left. And they want to do so by sort of joining up with the Popular Front, the leftist movement of the late 1930s, right? I don't know if you all have already talked about the Popular Front and why that was so important And they also wanted to get on board with this new labor insurgency that was happening. So in 1935, there's a convention of the American Federation of Labor, and they're having their convention, and they're very much a craft union, meaning they're only organizing mostly white and skilled workers. But at this convention, there's a rogue group that says, no, we have to organize the unorganized, and we have to do so in anti-racist ways. So John L. Lewis is one of them. He's the head of the miners union, and he actually gets into a fist fight with the head of the carpenters union. And they walk out and they form this new group called the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And so this group holds a lot of hope for these African Americans on the left, because they saw it as a vehicle for liberation. The idea that the CIO could organize across racial lines, but then in addition to that, organize millions of Black workers into industrial unions seemed like to have a revolutionary potential. And so the early parts of my book talk about these strategies to unionize, big gains in terms of steel workers, big gains in other fields, to the point where by World War II, you have, over 1 million Black workers that are organized in these militant unions. And of course, communists help this organization. They're some of the most dynamic organizers. And so the National Negro Congress is trying to hook up with the union movement to make it into a civil rights type movement. John P. Davis is the head of the National Negro Congress. And his thing that he says over and over again is, we have to make the New Deal understand that human rights are more important than property rights. And that is the American way, not the idea of capitalism and property rights always triumphing over human rights. So in a way, what develops by the late 1930s is a broad human rights movement that has international connections through anti-fascism around the world. Richard Wright, so you see this article here, he's very inspired by this. Richard Wright defects from the left a few years later. But I think early on, it shows that this group and this network of people really inspires not just laborers, but Black intellectuals, Black artists, Langston Hughes, you name it, Arna Bontemps, all the famous writers and Black actors, and of course, Paul Robeson, who is the first music that you saw for today's session. And I'm sure you know a lot about Paul Robeson, so I won't go into great detail about him. So the NNC in the late 30s, just a couple of quick things. One is that they do a remarkable job in Washington, D.C. In D.C., rather than picking jobs as their main priority, they do work for jobs as shown by this group of Black women who get access to these high-paying aircraft manufacturing jobs in the Washington, D.C. area, thanks to the National Negro Congress. But the main thing that they're concentrating on is something that we're living with today, which is a massive campaign against police brutality. And they're so effective in Washington in building a giant coalition that I can't remember if it's 1940 or 41, not a single African American for the first time in decades was killed by the Washington, D.C. Police Department. So they got a police review board in place, they protested, there were huge mass marches, etc. So that's just to give you an understanding of sort of what was going on in this parent organization that led to the youth part of the organization. And I will say that the youth part of the organization is kind of a misnomer in a way. There were older people in the Southern Negro Youth Congress from the very beginning. And then by the time we get to Modjeska Simkins in 1945, 46, there were several adults who were, members and associates and advisors to the Southern Negro Youth Congress. The NNC largely operated in the North and the Midwest and the West, whereas the Southern Negro Youth Congress, they thought that the challenge of young people in particular was to tackle the South. So this blurry picture that you see right here is one of the most remarkable achievements of the early Southern Negro Youth Congress. This is them in Richmond, Virginia, which was their first headquarters. James Jackson's from Richmond, Virginia, very famous Black communist who's important to what happens in Colombia. They start to organize a tobacco stemmers union. Tobacco stemmers are like the lowest of the low in terms of employment, often hiring Black workers at piecemeal rates, often older workers, people who are disabled, and paying them to sit in these damp, humid, intolerable conditions for 12 hours a day, stemming tobacco to be processed into the bigger tobacco plants. So the Southern Negro Youth Congress organizes unions of the stemmers, and they do a remarkable job. They get contracts, they win over several Richmond, owners. There's a lot of conflict over it, and it seems like the Battle of Richmond is on in 1937-38. And what's remarkable about this too is that the CIO, that labor organization I mentioned earlier, had zero interest in organizing Black workers in the South, unfortunately, in the late 30s. They were going into the South, but they were mostly concentrating on white textile workers. And here is the Southern Negro Youth Congress, young African Americans organizing an older generation of African Americans and succeeding, showing the CIO that Black workers are actually the vanguard of organizing for the South. So this is an important precursor to stuff that happens later, like Bob Korstad's book about civil rights unionism in Winston-Salem. I mean, some of the major victories of this union that eventually becomes the Food and Tobacco and Agriculture and Allied Workers, FTA, remarkable strides in terms of African-American union power in the South that is not often talked about. Okay, and so the Southern Negro Youth Congress continues on into the war period. This is a rally about voting rights, and this is from New Orleans. So, it's sprouting up in various places. It's in New Orleans. There's really active chapters in Florida, surprisingly. Alabama is a stronghold during World War II around Birmingham and the rural areas, etc. And so what's going on during World War II is that Esther Cooper Jackson, this woman I mentioned earlier, takes over and she becomes the executive secretary of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. Now, I think that's super important to understand that Black feminism is something that's supported within this movement, lifting up Black female leaders in particular. And the fact that you have Esther Cooper Jackson as the head of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, and you have Thelma Dale as the head of the National Negro Congress during the 40s, during the war period, I think is really important to understanding the kind of cultivating the leadership that's developing, specifically among women, right? That they're not taking a backseat to men as they do in other organizations at the time. This is a photograph of one of the many youth centers that were created during the war, during Alabama. And you might think, oh, youth center, no big deal, like kids playing ping pong. But these youth centers became really important culturally for generating a lot of young people and getting them involved in the movement that's developing during World War II. An increasingly militant movement, right? The double V for victory abroad, V for victory at home against fascism. And you can see in the background here, there's remarkable art and art shows being done by these young people. And this is in rural Alabama, right? Some of the youth centers are in Birmingham, but other places are in the more rural communities. One of those people who ran a youth center during World War II was a young woman who had a baby named Sally Davis, and the baby became Angela Davis. So you can see the connection between what's incubating in the Southern Negro Youth Congress and Angela Davis, Black Power, the Black Panthers, Black communism that's in the 60s, right? A later generation. Okay. So after the war, the Southern Negro Youth Congress gets into a lot of interesting campaigns, like the Oust Bilbo campaign. Bilbo was this horrific white supremacist senator from Mississippi who was elected by a tiny percentile of the white vote every time back into the Senate. And so they're suggesting that Bilbo needs to go because he is a symbol of fascism at the end of the war. So what you see at the end of World War II is a real kind of ramping up of movement activity. And I just want to really stress that a lot of historians make the mistake of thinking that as soon as World War II ended, we got into the Cold War with the Soviet Union. That's not true. Between 1945 and 1947, you have this remarkable upsurgence of hope and optimism that there's a mass movement that's going to be developed in the United States with these international connections now that fascism has been defeated abroad. And so you see this great optimism, and we shouldn't read into that period, the later period that I'm going to talk about, of McCarthyism that destroys it. So why South Carolina? Well, there are many reasons. One is that there's a remarkable group of chapters that develop in the Southern Negro Youth Congress. If you go to Howard Spingarn Archives, you can find folders on Moncks Corner, Columbia, Charleston, and several other tiny towns. And they're developing chapters right out of World War II. Another reason, though, is that what the adults did previous to the Southern Negro Youth Congress coming to South Carolina and making that the focus, which is the key challenge of 1944, right? The fact that South Carolinians created their own Democratic Party, elected delegates democratically, and then went to Chicago and challenged the all-white delegation at the Democratic Convention was a very powerful radical act. This is often forgotten about, right? Those who study the civil rights movement of the 60s probably know about this, the big challenge that SNYC made in Atlantic City in 1964 at the Democratic Convention. But this happened in 1944, right? They did not get what they wanted in Chicago, but it showed a kind of intergenerational unity and militancy. And of course, Modjeska Simkins was one of the key players in that, as well as Osceola McCain, John McCrae, and others. So Southern Negro Youth Congress comes in, and they want to take advantage of this energy. So they form a leadership training school at Harbison Junior College. I'm sure some of you may have been to IRMO or even been in that building. And they're training a younger generation coming out of the war to become freedom fighters. And all of that then leads to this great convergence of interests in the Columbia Conference of October 1946. Nothing was quite like this conference. They really believed that a death blow to Jim Crow was within their reach in 1946, and we really should understand that. An unprecedented number of people came, delegates from all over the country and some from around the world. And the keynote speakers were really a list of all-stars. And I won't go into all of the program of what happened there, except to say that it was set up like a world delegation where they were supposed to, it was called the Southern Youth Legislature, meaning that they were going to legislate their vision, an anti-racist vision for the South after World War II. And so all of these sessions came up with all of these ideas about how to make the South democratic, how to move forward after World War II. And it's a really powerful blueprint, a lot of which is still not achieved to this day. Other things. I think it's really important to understand that W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the most recognized, activists, authors, intellectuals of the 20th century, he comes down to Columbia to be the keynote speaker, and he gives one of the most remarkable speeches he's ever given in his entire career, called "Behold the Land." So this photograph, this image here, is the pamphlet that Southern Negro Youth Congress members sold after he gave the speech. They would sell it at churches in small Southern towns. They'd pass it out. And the drawing is from a very famous African-American artist named Charles White. Behold the Land, I won't go into all the details about what this speech entails, but what Du Bois is basically saying is, for a couple of generations, we've been avoiding the South. We've we've basically emphasized migration to the north and west, right? You got two huge waves of the Great Migration, one during World War I, a second one that happens during World War II. And people are moving increasingly to these western and northern cities. Du Bois is kind of saying at the end of World War II, enough, that we need to actually look at the South as the epicenter of the post-war movement. And stop trying to run away from the sort of center of the problem and cast our bucket down and start a mass movement for democracy in the South itself. And so he was really inspired by the Southern Negro Youth Congress and remained friends with a lot of the key leaders in the Southern Negro Youth Congress for years afterwards, even after he moves to Africa at the end of his life. So, you know, there's a real movement happening, and Columbia is sort of the fuse that sets this off. This conference is so exciting. At the same time that this conference is happening, just to put this in an international framework, James Burns, who is Secretary of State, is abroad trying to negotiate with the Soviet Union and other countries for the fate of what's going to happen in the post-war world. These activists who convened in Columbia thought that that was terribly inappropriate, given the fact that James Burns from South Carolina had a real history of white supremacy. Who is he to negotiate the post-war democratic world, especially when that world is made up principally of people of color? So there's a lot of criticism of Burns at this conference as well. And a vision is put out there for a different kind of post-war international order that does not involve in antagonizing the Soviet Union, does not involve getting into a 50-year arms race and a Cold War, but rather some of the vision embraced by Henry Wallace, who's running for president 2 years later, right? The idea of you know, sort of negotiations and a peaceful world as a result of the war, not more war and antagonism. This is a report of Esther Cooper Jackson during the conference. I've got all these amazing documents like this that I've recovered from Howard Spingarn. You know, she's talking about all of the things that need to happen in the post-war South, right? Free from the terror of the lyncher's rope, free from the reality of the job insecurity and the specter of starvation, etc. Lining up a kind of incredible vision for what a post-war democratic South could look like in 1946. I should also say that Paul Robeson was there, and the conference ended with a dance, not with Paul Robeson singing, obviously. Paul Robeson's songs were much more earnest, and sort of everyone, there was a lull in the room when Paul Robeson spoke, right? But you know, the fact that Paul Robeson was there as well as Du Bois, I think really mattered. Young people really looked up to Robeson as their sort of role model for how you could be a really important political activist and an anti-racist. Robeson gave a speech and he also sang several songs. It's interesting that, you know, Robeson really embodied the main character in this novel, Freedom Road, that came out right at this same time. So the other thing I would mention about the conference is there was this young white leftist author named Howard Fast who wrote this book called Freedom Road that was about this guy named Gideon, who and it basically was a novelistic way to tell the real history of Reconstruction. The idea that African Americans did not fail, they were succeeding too much, and that's what brought Reconstruction down in the 1870s, right? Interracial democracy had hit the South. And in fact, a very young Black leftist, I think he was only 17 years old at the time, walked into the Columbia Conference and he saw the banners all along the walls of all the Black senators and all the Black congressmen who had represented Southern states during Reconstruction in the 1870s. And he later admitted he had never even known that African Americans had represented the South in any way in history, right? So in a way, like, you know, history is being remade in Columbia in 1946, right? The old sort of Gone with the Wind, white supremacist history is no longer believed in. And African Americans like Du Bois, Robeson, Howard Fast, others are creating this new history as a usable past to move forward in 1946. They feel like 46 is a new period of Reconstruction after World War II, but this time they're going to achieve democracy that they lost back in the 1870s. So that was the conference that was just so powerful. And I think, though, we need to go beyond that conference a little bit. And so what I want to finish up by talking about is the legacy of what happens. So I'm sure you all know that the Cold War ramps up after 1946 and 1947. You get things like the Taft-Hartley Act, which really, curbs organized labor's ability to militantly organize. It kicks, because unions are faced with the choice of whether to kick all the communists out or to continue to be certified by the federal government and the National Labor Relations Board. Most of those unions choose to kick the communists out, right? And so they lose the sort of heart and soul of the movement, right? All of a sudden, thousands of incredible activists, union organizers, and others are just yanked off the stage, right? Including Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was a household name in the 1940s, not just among African Americans, but white Americans. By the time you get to the mid-1950s, he is, anathema. He is, the sort of caricatured and red baited into being this awful person, right? That no one should talk to, or that no one should, that is unpatriotic, etc. A similar thing happened to a lot of people in the Southern Negro Youth Congress and the National Negro Congress. They were all red baited, right? And when the government has the authority, or takes the authority, to suspend civil liberties, suspend free speech, and throw people in jail for their political beliefs, it is hard to combat, right? It was hard enough to combat the Jim Crow South and all of the sort of senators like Bilbo and local law enforcement and all those other things that sort of had sustained this Jim Crow apartheid. But when the federal government colludes with all of these people, it became really impossible to organize. And I think Brett might talk later a little bit about the last meeting of the Southern Negro Youth Congress in Birmingham in 1948, where the police literally break it up. And there's a young police commissioner there in 1948 named Bull Connor. And that's the same Bull Connor who looses the fire hoses and the dogs on protesters in Birmingham in 1963 during the campaign there that is much more famous and known than the campaign of 1948. So, what happens? Well, in many ways, the human rights movement that's coming out of World War II becomes red-baited and domesticated, right? It becomes a much more narrow civil rights movement. And a lot of activists are faced with the choice of whether they're going to abide by this new kind of permissible politics or resist it, right? And resisting it led to a lot of trauma. Resisting it meant you were blacklisted. Lots of the Black left were immigrants from places like Jamaica and other places. The INS got after them and deported many of those leaders. Many others ended up in jail for, charges like lying under oath or something along those lines, etc. Revels Caton, who was the young head of the National Negro Congress in 1946 and 47, ended up driving a bus. The people who resisted really went through a very traumatic experience, and we can't underestimate that trauma. The people who complied were largely leftists and liberals who, were socialists, and they had long been anti-communist. So they were kind of happy to go along with this new anti-communism, even though I think it was to their own downfall. And so you get African Americans who are still in the fight into the 50s, like George L.P. Weaver, who gets promoted into a high officialdom in the labor movement. Of course, A. Philip Randolph remains relevant because he, throughout his career, was a staunch anti-communist, etc. the civil rights movement that emerges in the mid 1950s emerges in a very different place because of the chilling effect of the Cold War and the McCarthyism that resulted. It really helps explain, why did the civil rights movement emerge in the South in the way it did? Why did it emerge from Black middle class leaders rather than working class people? Why did it, why were the tactics much more about sort of the right to sit on a bus or the right to be at a lunch counter rather than economic justice? And why did the world network that had existed between activists that were in the US South and activists who were in West Africa, London, France, the Caribbean, Cuba, why did that go away, right? And it was all due to the fact of this real sea change that happened during this period that crushed the Southern Negro Youth Congress in the late 1940s. Now, that said, there was resonance, and one of the resonances of the Southern Negro Youth Congress was a magazine called Freedom Ways. And Freedom Ways started, I believe, in the 50s, or maybe it was 60 was the first issue, I can't remember. And it was led by former members of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, like Esther Cooper Jackson. And they basically developed this magazine as the only way they knew how to inform the younger generation about the kind of politics and vision that they understood to be important. And so if you look through the pages of Freedom Ways, you see all of these amazing articles about connections to Africa, about labor, about the kind of 1930s, 40s human rights vision that was so important. And by the time you get to past 1965 and the civil rights movement, you get people from SNYC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you get others who are increasingly embracing and coming back to this 1940s vision that's so much more powerful, that's trying to take on institutional racism rather than just, the sort of symbolic forms of Jim Crow. And not just in the South, but all across America. So I think I'll stop there for the moment and maybe take some questions or comments and see if we can get into a dialogue about this material over the next, I don't know, half hour, 45 minutes. Thanks so much for listening, everybody.
Yes, that definitely deserves a round of applause. So let's go ahead and get some questions in. I already see one from Cecil Rigby in the chat. He asked, what kind of pushback, if any, was there within the SNYC to the kinds of alliances that ultimately led to the movement being crushed?
Yeah, that's a great question. There were certain SNYC members who were more sort of newer members who, when McCarthyism really started to emerge in 47 and after, kind of thought, oh, well, wait, I didn't know we had communists in the Southern Negro Youth Congress. Like, maybe we shouldn't, and maybe this is bad. They were like less informed members. But I think overall, I remember this pamphlet they put out in 48 about James and Esther Cooper Jackson, and just like, these people have been open communists since the 30s. Like, they were crucial to this organization. Do you think that they're bad people and that they're like out to do, that they're evildoers in the world, like the sort of red baiting was painting them? Absolutely not, So I would say the SNYC wasn't crushed from within. It wasn't like there was a number of SNYC members who just capitulated, but it was crushed by, just intense repression, right? Their leaders were all on the run. James Jackson was one of the Smith Act people. He had to go underground for several years and abandon his wife and young family. It was tough to sustain an organization, especially in the South after 1948. And, you've got the Attorney General requiring any group like the Southern Negro Youth Congress to register as a foreign agent with the federal government, right? And it just made it impossible to organize. It was already a really brave and amazing task that these Southern Negro Youth Congress organizers were doing things like going into rural towns in Alabama, investigating rape cases, challenging police brutality in Alabama and Washington and other places. So, I think by the time you get to 48, it was really like the writing was on the wall, and it just became impossible to operate anymore, without, dying and or going to jail.
Eric, let me add something to Cecil's question that
Sure.
Simpkins was renovated at the time. And I remember two things she said about that. One, she said, I'll work with it if you go on my way. The other was when she was asked, are you a communist? She'd say, no, but if they're doing all those good things you say they are, maybe I should be. But that what happened to her in the icing of her from the state conference of the NAACP that she was a founder of in 1939 was renovating, and that the ministers, the Black upwardly mobile ministers that I'm sure chafed at this very headstrong woman running the show and having more impact than they were, saw it as an opportunity to get rid of her. And that she was left off the ballot for office. She was the executive secretary of the state conference, and they left her off the ballot, and I think it was 57. And there's a letter that we have, and we'll share with the students, to her people saying, I didn't do this. I didn't abandon you. And so it was at a time when she was having to step back in order to not damage or make it not exacerbate the circumstance where NAACP members were being fired for not signing a loyalty oath in South Carolina school teachers.
Right.
And so in which was it? Well, all right, I lost my thread there, but you take it back, Eric. I just want to share some things about the home team doing that. And
yeah. No, I think you raised a good point, and I should have mentioned this earlier. Like, the McCarthyism of the period doesn't just go after, communists. They go after anyone that's involved in the Popular Front, small c communists, right? Anyone who had gone to a meeting about justice, democracy, feminism, labor, was now a suspect, right? And the Southern Negro Youth Congress was labeled by the federal government a, quote, communist front. Now, what does that mean, right? In their view, the whole Southern Negro Youth Congress had been a giant conspiracy, a front, a fake of like an organization that didn't really exist. It was just some kind of communist, conspired idea, which is an insult to every single one of those members who, fought and struggled over that 10-year period that the SNYC was in action, and so it wasn't just, communists who got wrapped up in this. It was a whole generation of activists who just got, ripped off the stage, through these actions. So, and also, I guess one other thing, in the 30s and 40s, it's important to remember that before McCarthyism existed, whether you were or were not a card-carrying member of the Communist Party was not a big deal. It just wasn't. Like, communists worked with others who were fellow travelers, and sometimes they didn't even know who was a member and who wasn't, right? And so it's only the McCarthy period that puts that stigma on it, like you are or you aren't, right? In the 30s, 40s period, liberals, radicals of different sorts, including lots of communists, worked together in various means. And sure, they had fights at various points about, Marxist ideas or ideas about revolution or et cetera. But, it was not this sort of strict, are you or are you not a member of the Communist Party thing until later.
There's another great question to chat. There's one from Cecil, and we'll get to one from Omari in a second. But Cecil poses a really interesting question about post-World War II organizing. He wrote, were Black post-45 war veterans encouraged to get involved in this or similar organizations?
Yes. In fact, one thing that made the Southern Negro Youth Congress so hopeful was the veterans who were coming home in 45. And so a lot of their male leaders all volunteered to fight, and they saw action in places like Burma, right, in the Eastern Front of the war. They came home, and they were coming home ready to engage, even in guerrilla warfare if necessary. People don't realize that when Medgar Evers came home from World War II, before he became an NAACP guy, he was strategizing about how can we create a guerrilla war in Mississippi, right? Like, is there a way? Are there tactics, right? You know, the Army did an ironic thing during World War II. They brought together 1 million Black men, segregated them, and taught them how to use firearms and taught them how to do other military-like things, right? This created an upsurge of militant Black activity, right? You know, Robert F. Williams is one example, right? From who ends up back in North Carolina, right? He serves during World War II. And so there's a militant generation coming home, and actually in the book itself that you can see in, I think it's the chapter on World War II in Alabama, right after the war, there's a massive march through the streets of Alabama for voting rights. And it was just full of Black veterans who just dared the police to do something, right? And it was like a coming out of, you know, just militancy and a kind of Black pride and anti-fascism. So not every Black veteran, of course, got so radicalized, but a lot of them did, and a lot of them allied with the Southern Negro Youth Congress during this period of like 46, 47, and 48.
Eric, you mentioned in your book, but I want to mention now that one of those vets coming home was Isaac Woodard. And he wasn't protesting, he was just trying to go home. And so we will share with the class and the study guide that we had for last year. We haven't sent that thing out in its entirety, but it's got the story in there. And I think the really prescient part of the story is told by Orson Welles. And then Orson Welles had a national NAACP program. This was before podcast. And his radio program was reaching nationwide, had 3 installments on the blinding of Isaac Woodard. And that was a young Black GI coming home, had his eyes poked out in Batesville, South Carolina, about 25 miles from where I'm sitting, that continues to still be whitewashed. And that the president, it was Truman, had him in the office. Isaac became kind of a statement against the treatment of GIs coming home or ending a war in terms of fighting Aryan supremacy. They're coming home to Jim Crow. And so it leveraged some of the things that Truman did, but it hadn't changed a whole lot in South Carolina. And so that was one of the things that I think brought the SNYC conference in October. I think the blinding was in February, Orson Welles stuff was in April. There was a fundraiser for Woodard in a stadium in New York City with 36,000 people, with all the A-listers at the time, Billie Holiday and Milton Berle. So people around the world knew it, but also South Carolina at that time was the last state refusing to let Black people participate in the white-only primary. And Texas had lost in the Supreme Court, Georgia lost in the Supreme Court, leading up to that 46 case with Elmore, the Elmore case in South Carolina, which we'll talk about next class, that there was the last place where Black people really couldn't get into the process of electoral politics. And that's another element that the world was watching. Is this going to continue? De jure segregation. So South Carolina was the firing line.
Yeah.
Right. And I think speaking to that point about the Palmetto State being the firing line, this actually ties directly into Mari's question in the chat. He wrote, Dr. Green often breaks down why South Carolina hasn't been regarded as a staple of the civil rights movement, here in the home of critical race theory and medically adequate. But why do you think the internal and external perception of South Carolina is so counter-revolutionary, considering our luminaries like Modjeska Simkins, the Conference 1946, etc.?
Well, I've never thought of it that way. studying, going way back to even like John's Island and some of the stuff that's happening along there culturally, politically. I guess South Carolina has had that perception because they're also a state that has rabid white supremacy, right? They're the first state to secede from the Union and start the giant mistake that was the Civil War and the Confederacy. They're a state of great repression as well. But I don't know. I've never thought of South Carolina as being a counter-revolutionary place compared to other parts of the South. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think? What do you think, Robert?
I think this is a really interesting question because, and I'm coming at this as someone who teaches college on a college level here in South Carolina. The problem I often see is that most students here in the state are not taught this history in K through 12. So when they, for example, encounter the SNYC in a college course, or Modjeska Simkins, or numerous other things we talk about in the Modjeska school, they're genuinely surprised and flummoxed by it. I think there's also a bigger issue with, because I've actually written about this elsewhere, that part of the problem with how we teach the civil rights movement, at least in terms of K through 12, even to an extent on the college level, it's still trying to work out things like what is the long civil rights movement, how do we fit in groups like the SNYC, et cetera, because it's a very different narrative if you actually start in the 30s and you talk about the National Negro Congress, the SNYC, and so forth, versus if you just start with Brown v. Board or Emmett Till. Either way, I think you're absolutely right, Eric, that the state of South Carolina should be regarded as a place of not just white supremacy and turmoil, but also a place that has produced some great, genuine revolutionaries. Folks, men and women who were trying to make things for the better, not just in this state, but across the country. And if you look at the SNYC around the world, I think it's up to us as historians to do more work in the public arena to make folks aware that this state is not just some state that's like a red dot on the map every 4 years through an election season. It actually has its own interesting history.
Well, I don't want to suggest that our good doctors aren't thinking the same thing I am at this point, but South Carolina did get a jump on this white supremacy thing in the mid 1700s, before America was America, but by the Barbadians bringing in thousands of enslaved people and establishing, the United States of America as a slave nation. And so the masters here have had a long time to practice, and they're very effective.
Yeah, I also just think about the citizenship schools that started, and became a real model for freedom schools everywhere, including the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. I mean, the South Carolina version predated anything else like that in the South. Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, I don't think this history has to be taught in any particular way. I think it just has to be put out there for people to, figure out their own analysis, right? Like, why don't people know about Osceola McCain? I mean, he's just a remarkable person, a World War I veteran who ends up in Belgium and opens a jazz club, has no intention to come back, but then the Nazis invade Belgium, right? And so he comes back, and he could go anywhere. Where does he come back to? His hometown in South Carolina, and starts organizing, right, the Progressive Democratic Party. He gets involved in union organizing in 46. I mean, it's just powerful stuff. And, there's also a lost history of South Carolina in terms of some union stuff that happens after the war, in terms of the big tobacco factories in Charleston and other places. So, I think, I'm not sure why South Carolina gets tagged that, but I don't think it's true. And, I think South Carolina has just this incredible and complicated history that in many ways predates other attempts that have happened and perhaps have been more successful. But a lot of the sort of blueprint for the struggle, the Black freedom struggle, in various ways comes out of South Carolina.
Dr. Gellman, one of the things that really struck me in my readings about SNYC and the organizing work that happened was that they really understood the importance of culture and the arts to movement building. And one of the things I remember reading about, which I was really taken with, was their caravan puppeteers that I think were like early, like 1940, I think, in Alabama. They were organizing in rural Alabama. And I'm wondering if you have seen any scripts or any kind of photographs from those things, because what I'd really like the Modjeska School to do is kind of replicate some of that stuff as a way to showcase SNYC in a different way. Have you seen any of the material? They did other theater stuff too. I think they had a theater in Birmingham. Have you seen any of that in your research?
I'm very aware of it, and I'm aware of all kinds of references to it, but I've never encountered a folder full of like scripts and like other like photographs and material. But it's possible that that stuff exists, and it's just at Howard at the Moreland Spin Guard, and that for whatever reason the Southern Negro Youth Congress papers are still not processed, right? So there's no finding it online. You can't figure out what they have. You just got to go to Howard and look through those boxes. But yeah, I mean, I find that remarkable, like that they're touring this like anti-racist puppet show. You know who was part of that for a period? Pete Seeger.
Yeah.
And Warren Cooney, who becomes this famous Black poet. Yeah, I mean, the cultural stuff that they're doing is really amazing. I mean, Josh White puts out these series of, Josh White, the famous blues singer, puts out this series of 78s that are all anti-Jim Crow songs that are really radical. And Richard Wright writes the liner notes, and Warren Cooney is in there too, of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. It's like the stuff they were doing is just, you know, really powerful. And I think, you know, with the school in Irmo and other places, that's the kind of stuff the movement building that was so important, right? And they never took the cultural stuff for granted. And so, you know, there's also this period, they're rewriting American history during this period, right? That they had all been brainwashed to believe that, you know, when they grew up, like, you know, Gone with the Wind was the #1 most popular film, not just in America, but among Howard University students in 1938. Okay? So think about all the education work that has to be done, right? It's not a coincidence that Du Bois writes Black Reconstruction in 1935, but they take that up. I mean, after the Columbia Conference, I forgot to mention this, SNYC tours the South, selling the Du Bois pamphlet, with Herbert Aptheker as the speaker, going to all the HBCU colleges and talking about the actual, real, evidence-based African-American history that is a history of slave rebels, it's a history of struggle, it's a history of democracy, etc. It's the history that, like, you know, today is under threat, just like it was then.
No, that's a really good point.
I want to point out that Modjeska was invited to speak. She considered Aptheker a great friend, and he spent much time in her home here. She was invited to be a keynote at a 1966 conference in Manhattan at the launch of Aptheker's 50th book. The gifts list is available online. I've got it if somebody wants it, but it included luminaries from Howard Zinn to elected officials to Gus Hall. And Simkins begged off because of that, the pressure against the NAACP here, and that her touting her relationships with the commies probably wasn't real productive. And I just want to throw out that I want everybody, all the students, to recognize the trope of the status quo taking a boogeyman and attributing people that are fighting the status quo to saying they're fighting for the boogeyman. And trust me, none of the communists I've known in my life were fighting for the Soviet Union or Russia. They were fighting for rights where their feet touch the ground, using the ideology of communal sharing, like a cooperative relationship other than one based on property. And so that's the way those things are twisted.
No, that's a great point. And I want to put this again in the chat. I know Eric mentioned a moment ago, Freedom Ways, the magazine. I put this in the chat earlier, but I'm going to put it there again. Freedom Ways is actually available to read online now. If you go to JSTOR, JSTOR, which is the repository of many journals, academic journals, they're also trying to build up a section about newspapers and magazines that were created by the left. There's some actually far right stuff on there too that's really scary to read, but it's actually quite relevant to today's context. But Freedom Ways is on there. The complete run from 1961 to 1985 is on JSTOR. I would highly recommend checking it out at some point if you just want something good to read. And it has a lot of stuff there that really shows how the various lefts of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s were trying to work together to figure things out in the country. Speaking of which, there's another question in the chat. Why was the old guard of the SNYC eventually replaced by a great number of ministers?
Yeah, so I think that question is kind of what I was alluding to about, like, when you get the emergence of the mid 1950s civil rights movement, it comes as a very different package, and that's deliberate, right? Black men ministers, middle class ministers wearing suits, right? And not really talking about economic justice at all, at least not at first. And I think that is deliberate because if you think about, by the mid 1950s, what is permissible in terms of politics in America, the one group that is hard to red bait is the Black church in the South, right? They tried anyway, right? They put up these billboards of a picture of Martin Luther King at the Highlander saying it was a communist training school, et cetera. But it was difficult to red bait the Black middle class church in particular. So that's why I think that it was packaged in that way, right? That the Southern movement thought that they could gain a modicum of leverage if they engaged in respectability kind of politics. And so that's why I think there's a change in style, there's a change in tactics, et cetera, as a means to try to break through in the mid 1950s, where the pressure points of the terrain of struggle had changed so tremendously that it sort of had to initially come from that group. Does that make sense? Or did anyone on this thing in this session disagree with me? I'm curious.
You left out opportunism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to put, I mean, I think given the context of the mid 1950s, you didn't have a lot of choices.
Yeah.
I mean, you could defy authority, and many people did. Their passports were taken away, they were deported, put in jail. One of the key members of the Southern Negro Youth Congress was a Black Pullman porter named E.D. Nixon. Does that name ring a bell? E.D. Nixon was more responsible than anyone for, behind the scenes for the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 and 1956. He's a former labor organizer. He's a radical in the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And when this thing erupts, he figures out how to organize it, right? Of course, there's a number of Black women like Joanne Gibson Robinson and others who are instrumental in doing this in 55, 56. But E.D. Nixon is really like the backbone of a lot of what's happening. And it's a direct link to the Southern Negro Youth Congress, right? So he knows what he's doing. And how it's being framed, right? They did not pick Claudette Colvin as their person when she got arrested on a Montgomery bus in 1955. They picked Rosa Parks because they needed to frame it as respectable nonviolence, as a means to gain some traction. And it worked to a degree.
Dr. Green, if I may want to recognize Senator Maggie
Sure.
Glover, former Senator Maggie Glover is with us, as well as former Representative Kathleen Kempe. And the beloved Reverend Tom Summers, one of our members from before the beginning, is with us tonight. I wanted to recognize Reverend Summers. But I want to ask my question to Dr. Gellman, is that the Southern Negro Youth Congress protesting the tobacco workers' situation in Richmond, that was about the same time there was a tobacco strike at the cigar factory in Charleston. Connection? Are you aware of one?
Well, which organizing? Are you talking about 1936, 37?
The 40s, in the 40s.
Oh, the 40s, yeah. No, okay, so I've been for 10 years now in the midst of this giant collaborative project, because I think there's one key piece of information about the 30s, 40s era that's missing in the historiography, and that is analytical history of this union called UCAPAWA /FTA, the United Cannery and Agricultural and Allied Workers Union, which becomes the Food and Tobacco and Allied Workers, etc. This union was the left of the left. The CIO didn't even want them in their, in their body, because they were so anti-racist and so multiracial in what they did. And no one has told their full history because their records were either destroyed or lost in the 70s. But they were just this remarkable organized group. And so the period that you're talking about with Richmond and also Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and also Charleston, all of those tobacco workers were in the FTA, and they were part of this left-wing movement group that was in the CIO, organizing Black tobacco workers and trying to convince the organizers of Operation Dixie, which was this huge CIO campaign to come to the South after World War II, that they understood how to organize workers, versus the Operation Dixie version, which is a bunch of white guys sitting up in the North thinking they knew how to organize the South. And they botched it so badly, right? In many ways, the defeat of Operation Dixie has cast a shadow over the South and the union movement in the South ever since, right? The failure of that, I mean, here we are in North Carolina and South Carolina. What are the lowest union density states in the country, including District of Columbia? North Carolina and South Carolina. We're always competing for number 50 and number 51.
I mean, number one is something, Eric.
Yeah, we all, it depends on the year, but South Carolina is currently winning that battle to the race to the bottom, right? But so, I mean, what the Southern Negro Youth Congress really cared about was economic justice, right? And so did the civil rights movement, right? When things start developing by the mid-1960s, or even if you look at the March on Washington in 1963, right? The March on Washington was not just a march for freedom. It was a march for freedom and jobs. Look at the March on Washington's call to action. It's about minimum wages. It's about fair employment, right? Because when the African-American freedom struggle, when you ask people in the Black freedom struggle, like, what's most important here? It's always the jobs. It's always the economic justice part, right? Most, right? The ability to feed your family, to have stable work, and to thrive, in those conditions, right? So, yeah, so that's a long way of sort of addressing that question. That this union FTA, Modjeska was speaking to this union. I mean, I have records of her going to like Winston-Salem and talking to these people, and so anyway. She was well aware of this, and so was Osceola McCain, was organizing for the Southern Conference of Human Welfare, the CIO, the renegade CIO unions in 46. And it's just a tragedy what happened to the labor movement, that, the Taft-Hartley Act forced all these unions to choose. Do you want to continue to have protection from the federal government or not? And most unions were practical, and they chose the protection and kicked out all of their most militant organizers.
Oh, that's incredible. We have time for maybe one more question. Anybody else have a question for Dr. Gellman?
Dr. Gellman, before we let you, well, let me see, is there questions for Eric before we bid adieu?
I'm happy to answer any question, not just about the presentation, but anything else, that I'm not sure I can
ask real
answer.
quickly, Dr. Gellman, the tapes that you were waving around at the beginning,
Yeah.
were those were from town, the forum in '84, or was that something else? Is it
1989 Conference on Civil Rights
89?
Studies.
okay?
I don't know. I think these are ones that like some random staff member at the TAMIMET felt bad, like sort of was like, okay, I'll just secretly W these tapes, and because we might never find them again. I remember being back in the actual archive, like trying to look for stuff and going through stuff. And similarly, there's a tape about the Jacksons from '86 talking about the Southern Negro Youth Congress, et cetera. So I'd be happy to try to figure out a way to dub these or something, or digitize them eventually and get them to you all.
Well, I'll talk with you about that. We have a contact now, Tim, whose last name escapes me right now, but he's been working with the committees of correspondence with their school. And he has been staff at Southern. He's NYU.
Yeah, I know Tim. He's great. I'm not sure if he's still there anymore, but
He certainly knows where the skeletons are hidden.
oh, he does. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Mike, I want to talk about that. I understand you have another engagement and you need to leave. And I want to talk about what happened after 46. And that I'm going to set a prelude up and you add to it before you have to go.
Okay.
But one of the things we didn't mention about the conference in 46 in Columbia was Angela Davis's mother was there from Birmingham. Julian Bond's father was there from Atlanta. So the seeds of that continuation of that radical analysis were long planted. And that I'm quizzical that there's not a more substantive body of history in Birmingham where Ann Braden was working. And where when the Southern Student Organizing Committee left SNYC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in '64, I know that Sue Thrasher, who was the SNYC leader and then became a SOC leader, was really conflicted by having to make clean breaks with people like the Bradens who had strong communist connections. You know anything about that kind of link between the emergence of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and that anti-communist concerns that would have kept Ella Baker from ever mentioning SNYC?
Yeah, that's a complicated one because some of the people who were initially involved in SNCC and became sort of some of the key student leaders claim they knew nothing about the Southern Negro Youth Congress, which shows to you the sort of like how one generation had to try to reinvent the wheel a bit. But there are others where that clearly isn't true. Let's take James Foreman, for example. James Foreman is pivotal in SNCC and also its radicalization after 1964. He's the one who says after the '64 convention, when they offer 2 seats and they try to play by the rules, and the Mississippi delegation in Atlantic City, it says, well, if we can't sit at the table, we're going to knock the fucking legs off the table, right? I mean, because it's ridiculous, right? So Foreman is in Chicago. He's at Roosevelt University, my former employer. And who was his mentor at Roosevelt University? St. Clair Drake. I don't know if you know that name, but St. Clair Drake is one of the authors of Black Metropolis, one of the most famous studies of any city of Black America. But he's also a sociologist out of the Chicago school who breaks, of course, with the white sociologists in many ways from that school. St. Clair Drake was a bona fide active member of the National Negro Congress. during the war, World War II. So there's no doubt the connection between Drake and Foreman, and then Foreman goes south. I mean, it's obvious that, you know, maybe people didn't specifically say Southern Negro Youth Congress, but a whole generation of young people were being mentored by others who had experienced the movement of that 40s period and were informing them about it, right? And so I think there's many more connections than are currently known. And I wish Waldo Martin, my friend out on the West Coast, professor of history at UCLA, would finish his article or book that is specifically about the connections between the Southern Negro Youth Congress and SNCC. And in fact, you should try to get Waldo to come and talk about it, because he's been working on this thing for a while, and I don't know why he doesn't publish it. He has all of this new knowledge about connections between that 60s radicalism and the previous SNCC before. And you know, and I also think the SNCC strategy, right, was really important. One of the key things I try to tell my students about SNCC is, before this, in the civil rights movement of the 60s period or the late 50s, activists were chipping away at the edges of Jim Crow, right? They were in places like Nashville and Atlanta. What's made SNCC different was they said, we're going to attack the middle of the iceberg. And they deliberately went down to Mississippi. People thought they were insane to do that, right? And develop these intergenerational networks. Does that sound familiar to you? What happened in South Carolina in 1946? They said, let's go to Columbia, let's go to the middle of the iceberg, right? And develop these intergenerational networks and hope that a mass movement comes out of it, right? It's a similar strategy.
Well, we may need to get you to come down for our puppet show to the little towns where Modjeska had started chapters of Southern Negro Youth Congress, now pushing 75 years ago, and find the relatives and see if we can find a genetic fire in them that we can reignite.
I would love to. This is a weird fact, but my grandmother was a dirt poor farmer who grew up on the outskirts of Columbia, South Carolina. In fact, her parents are buried in a tiny Jewish cemetery that is dwarfed by the football stadium over there. It's the only piece of land that the football stadium couldn't take over because it was a cemetery. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that tiny Jewish cemetery, just like next to the football stadium over there. But anyway, so
Columbia,
Columbia, yeah.
Oh my.
well, come
There's
on.
a teeny tiny Jewish cemetery. Go over by the athletic, all that athletic stuff that has grown up next to campus.
Yeah.
And you will find the one piece of land they could not take over and rezone and repurpose is this tiny Jewish cemetery, and that's where my ancestors are buried. So I have a lot of deep roots for Columbia and South Carolina.
By the baseball stadium on Whaley Street.
I think that's it. Yeah. I can't remember what. Yeah.
I know.
Okay. Well, we'll put that on our field trip. Are they Gellmans?
No, they were Blooms.
Oh,
Yeah, Blooms. Yep.
well, let 1,000 flowers bloom, Eric. You're welcome anytime.
Yeah, I know, right? It's a kind of crazy story, but yeah, I mean, I'm, you know, I would love to come down there, schedule permitting, and take a tour and do whatever, and come by that Simkins house and you know, all that stuff.
We'll work that out. Well, I want to
Okay.
get to the what happened in 45 and 46. I understand that Modjeska spent pretty much the next 2 years after the 46 conference organizing for the 48 conference in Birmingham. You know anything about the work that she did or the travel that she did? I just know that she did.
You know what? In my book, I did not write about. I just write briefly about Birmingham. That is for some other enterprising person should take that up, because that last conference was a real spectacle. And of course, the connections there are also very evident. So young Jack Odell, who's at Columbia conference in 46, I don't know if any of you know who Jack Odell is, but he becomes a prominent Black leftist for the next 50 years. He's the guy advising Martin Luther King that John Kennedy takes King in the Rose Garden and says, I can't talk to you anymore unless you sever all connections with Jack Odell.
Yeah,
And King does it for a year and a half, and then he says, I need Jack Odell, and I'm gonna keep talking to him. Right.
I met Odell in '84 at Jackson's first presidential run, when Jackson was trying to set up the Rainbow Coalition, and Odell was literally the brains of the operation. And Odell said it wasn't going to work because we can't put Jesse in a box. That was in '84. And he just passed. Odell just passed, I think, a year and a half ago. He was in Vancouver.
Yeah, they're organizing a big thing for him this summer in Vancouver. It's going to be a who's who of who's left, I guess, of that left. But the reason I brought up Odell is that, okay, so Odell's very aware of what happened in Birmingham with the Southern Negro Youth Congress in 48 at that conference, and with Bull Connor. And so he is among a small circle of people who are advising Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King in 62 had just done this Albany, Georgia campaign. And it was a total disaster because the sheriff there, Laurie Pritchett, was smart. He didn't go for confrontation. So he just very quietly and peaceably arrested people. He didn't fill up the jail. He sent folks that got arrested to the county jails. And the Albany movement, as a result, given the tactics of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that rely on television, confrontation, mobilization, not the subtle organizing and day-to-day stuff that SNCC did, it failed, and they left Albany. So, King and the SALC left Albany. So they left Albany and they said, well, what do we do now? And Jack Odell and Stanley Levinson were advising King, and they said, go to Birmingham. You know why? Because Bull Connor's in Birmingham and he's stupid. He is going to use all kinds of violence against kids. And if you confront him with, so what develops in Birmingham in 63? Project C. They're using high school kids. I mean, there are like 8-year-olds going to jail, right? They knew that those were the optics they needed in Birmingham because they knew what Bull Connor was going to do before he did it.
Well, that's a good say what Bull Connor did in 48. And
because they knew Bull Connor ran them out of town in 48, right?
Becky's book, History Denied, has a good bit about the 48 conference in there. And I don't know if Becky will speak to it, but Robert, let me set it up and you can pick up anything that you know. But the conference in 48 in Birmingham was the last hurrah of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And the one in Columbia in 46 was just an international event, real bell ringer. And so that brought repression down. And that the conference in Birmingham, Modjeska spent a couple of years working to organize that, and had invited Glenn Taylor, who was a U.S. Senator from where, Becky? What town? I mean, what state? One of those Midwestern states?
I think he was from Wyoming.
Yeah.
I think
it was. Right? Yeah, I think it was Idaho. Either.
It might have been Idaho. The singing cowboy.
The singing senator. He was. He reminded me of an old wobbly activist. A singing guy, straight-spoken guy. But he was vice presidential candidate on the progressive ticket. The United States vice presidential candidate running for office as a sitting U.S. senator was the guest speaker for the 48 conference. And he advised, I don't know who he told he couldn't come, but he had been leaned on about communism in 1948. And Modjeska got on the phone and talked him into coming. And he did. And Bull Connor, meanwhile, had been leaning on the places that the conference was going to be at. And the conference, I think it was the third church. It could have been the fourth. The venues kept getting smaller and smaller. And so the conference was then scheduled at this small black church. And at the time, it was illegal for white and black people to go through the same door. And in some instances, according to local laws, sit on the same side even, or the same floor even of a building. And so the minister, this is legend, Robert or Eric, if you know different, speak up. The minister took a door off, turned it sideways. So there would be two entrances in the original door and had colored and white on one side or the other. And Senator Taylor came in, went through the colored door, and was promptly arrested by Bull Connor. He arrested a sitting senator and active vice presidential candidate for the United States of America. And Robert, I hope what you can add to that, because I don't know what happened to Senator Taylor after that. Or Becky, if you got something in your book. I'm not hearing any more comments on that.
Robert said he had.
But Glenn Taylor is an absolutely fascinating character. Who we have a picture in Becky's book, History Denied, that all the students are supposed to get a copy of. If you haven't gotten your copy, let us know, those of you that are active students in Zoom land. If you haven't gotten the last two copies of the books that Becky's produced, History Denied and Generation No, that would be small k, large N-O-W, and Generation No picks up in the early 60s and runs through the mid 80s. And these are books that are now acting as study guides for classes that cover this one in some time and for the rest of the session. So let us know if you're online that you haven't got the books, that you'd like to have them. And let me know. You can respond to any of our emails. We'll get you those books in the mail. And Eric will send you some too.
That would be great. And as an aside, if anyone wants me to send a copy of my book, I'll send a couple to you, Brad, or something like that for free. And if someone's particularly interested in this topic, please give it to them.
I certainly will. We're trying to maintain a library here ourselves.
So I have to sign off now to take care of my 6-year-old, but this has been fantastic. I always love talking with other people about this topic and all of the sort of complexity and urgency and how it relates to the struggle today. And so thank you, Brett, and thank you, Robert, and all of you for listening and engaging with me.
We look forward to having you for more than an hour or two down here. Bring the family and the cat, come down and visit us.
Oh, you noticed the cats, right? They're hungry too. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.
I want to know if the cat's name is Sabo.
No, not Sabo, but that would be a good name.
So thus ends our Zooming with Dr. Gellman, it's Gellman. And I have a few more thoughts about the Southern Negro Youth Congress, and that it was so sad. One of the pictures that we found that's in Becky's book was Modjeska having her Southern, and she called it a leadership training school that she started at this address of 2025 Marion Street, where she lived for 60 years. Right next door. In that house, Thurgood Marshall wrote the first brief that became Brown versus the Board. In that house, she started her leadership training school in 1946. Without knowing that she'd done that, we started the Modjeska School at 2025 Marion Street in the same house, like 69 years before she did, after she did, with the same damn curriculum, doing the same thing. And that's just like, and you erase it and people start over again. They don't know there's anybody organizing and doing that type of work. And we had an opportunity, and this is something I'm putting on the floor because this is something I hope some students would do, is Modjeska had these meetings at some HBCUs. She did one when Harbison, and Harbison is a Midland State Junior College now in in Columbia. And it was in 1946 a black college, a black junior college. And so some of the events were there, and her leadership training school was I believe it was a 10-day residential program where the students would come and study some of the same things we're studying now: public speaking, press releases, and their agenda was about better jobs, better pay. Ending police brutality was a big issue. And I mean, so little has changed. And so we took Becky's book to Allen University. That book has a picture of Modjeska in 1946 on the steps of a building with Allen students that were students in the leadership training school. There was no one, none of the faculty, none of the staff at Allen that knew that had happened. So it was just very sad. And we had reading. We worked with a librarian there. We gave out books to the students, and the students would read a page or a chapter. That's the type of thing we could be doing every year at all 9 HBCUs in South Carolina, including the white schools, where they may not be quite as receptive. But that's the type of stuff that we need to do to keep that thread that's been woven by people resisting the type of things we continue to resist for decades and decades, that are in danger of being lost.
Let me just say that having those students, the schools chose the Modjeska book as their book to read during library week. And so the whole campus was supposed to, it's available online, so anybody could have read it, and other people had we sent a box of hard copies there. And it was just really moving that these students took turns reading from the thing in front of the library at a podium, and their pride at seeing themselves reflected in history that they so often are ignored or erased from really meant a lot to me, and made me understand how important the work that we can do at the school is. And one of the projects that we've talked about doing, maybe it will take one person making it their mission to do it, is to track down some of the work that came out of that conference in 46. There were chapters. I think that at one point there were 14 chapters that were developed in high schools and on college campuses. And if you could track down, they've got newsletters. I've got copies of newsletters. Graham Duncan went to Howard and brought back a whole box of really fantastic material for us to look through. But like Dr. Gellman was saying, the stuff hasn't all been cataloged or organized or digitized, certainly. So before everybody dies, it would be great to get some people out in the field to some of the, like there was Newberry and Irmo and the different campuses, both high school and college campuses, to find some of the students that were involved in that work and help sustain that and talk to them and or their relatives, because it's really important that we get these stories while we can, and we're running out of time.
Well, yeah, that's could be harder and harder to find students who were actually there then, but we can find their grandchildren.
I got a couple of thoughts that's kind of related to my question in the thread.
Speak up a bit, Amari.
It's my radio voice. Now I put in the thread that, you know, I feel like it's a hip hop generation kid. Something about the 80s to me felt like a cutoff as far as transferring the wisdom. Like it's probably like 10 or 11 when Jesse Jackson was running. I was never really like into him as far as like, oh, that's a black guy running for president, let me get behind that. You know, even as a 10, 11-year-old. I didn't really feel like a sense of wokeness until hip hop started fighting against crack, you know, and speaking out against it. And I feel bad because probably 2 or 3 years later, after we took a really hard stance against crack, like everything was gangster rap and promoted selling crack, you know, ironically, and then getting into the 90s, the crime bill, you know, ironically Hillary and Biden calling, you know, the savage people and this and that. And I feel like my generation is still suffering from that crime bill. And I get it, be tough on crime coming out of Reagan, who brought the drugs in the country, Iran, Contra, I get it. My feeling from my parents is there was a lot of pain. So she didn't really want me to, I don't think she didn't want me to have the awareness, but she didn't want to go back to it and like transfer that part of it to me. And then what I said in the chat is like, I feel lucky that the BLM chapter was really founded next door, right before the Progressive Network meeting. So it just felt like synergy, you know, for me to segue to the network. But I haven't really found, I found like each police is, you know, and I'm glad that they talked about the police brutality element. I feel like the police part is very generational to the moment you come into the movement. So for me, it was the Zimmerman verdict in 2013. For other people, it was Ferguson in 14, you know, other things in between. And then I feel like George Floyd was the height of it. And I'm glad we were able to have a kind of a fireside on Zoom about it. But to me, it's just been hard to have intergenerational conversations. I would like to see one remotely approaching that 46 pitch. You know, anything like that could approach that, because, you know, we still talking about it now, you know, and I'm out the whole time I was thinking, it's like, what does the 2023 version of that looks like? There's so many different things on the table that we could be, you know, tackling.
I think it's us, Mr. Fox. I think it is. But the work that Simkins did, I keep learning more about it, and I spent more time in our house than anybody alive now. And so it's just really important that we establish some kind of viable institution, because obviously we're seeing actual laws passed not to study history.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Sensational.
So I think there are a lot of good ideas about getting some students involved in simple projects they can follow up on. And our next class tomorrow night at 6:30 is with the Center for Civil Rights Research. And Dr. Bobby Donaldson is somebody that helped us start the school. And even before we got it going in like 2014 and 15, he was very helpful. And he's just hands down the historian on Black history and civil rights history in South Carolina.
Other than Dr. Green.
Other than Dr. Green, other than Dr. Green. I was going to say Dr. Donaldson has been given $1.5 million to be able to keep the civil rights story going. And I'm not sure that anybody's going to give Dr. Green $1.5 million to keep the alternative story going, because they don't really want the alternative story told. But if Dr. Green's still there, we'll talk with you, if not about you. But Donaldson has put together a team that will be presenting the roadshow that they have. There's two of them, right, Becky? One is Columbia 63, and one is Our Story. But they're all about the civil rights movement, which I'm not sure where they start with it, but it certainly doesn't start, I don't believe, before 54. Dr. Donaldson was certainly very aware of the work that went on in the 40s and all with the Briggs versus Elliott lawsuit. But I don't know exactly where his presentation starts. He put together something in 2013 for the 50th anniversary of the 1953 civil rights movement that the city of Columbia sponsored and helped put on displays that Dr. Donaldson's carried on and making it statewide now. So it's their team next Monday, tomorrow night at 6:30. They will be here and they will be on Zoom across the state. Becky, anything to add?
No, I just would, I put a link to the Calumet Library's recordings of Esther Cooper Jackson about the SNYC forum. And it's really worth listen if you're ever on a drive or something and you need something to listen to. It's just a recording of that session, and it's fascinating. It's really, really good stuff.
Well, thank you, Becky. I'm reading now a question that Tayaba put in the chat about the cataloging project. And we will deal with Tayaba offline here, because we sure do have, we've got things that we never even scanned. That we could, our own archives are voluminous, and we need. So Tayaba, that's really your friend in helping with that.